thing which I'd like to talk about today hopefully will make a little bit clearer the sorts of connections which we have between our own human makeup and the environment around us, and even the course of history in which we find ourselves too. And even if you are talking about things on a global level, whether it's the environment or even the quality of life which you experience in a particular place or a time, it's always connected with the quality of mind of the people living in society at that time. And normally in Buddhism, we don't pay much interest at all to the idea of how the world started, how the world should end, or even where we came from in the first place. The reason why we do this is not because we don't have answers to these sort of questions, but it's because the Buddha thought that the more immediate questions in our life which we ought to be wasting our time thinking about are things like, now that we're in this mess, what can we do about it to get ourselves out of it? There's even a metaphor in the Buddhist scriptures about a man who has been shot with a poisoned arrow. And normally if you are shot with an arrow, then your first instinct should be to get the arrow out of your body as quickly as possible before that poison starts to get to work in your blood and to kill you eventually. But some people who the Buddha compared to intellectuals in the world, instead of pulling out the arrow as quickly as they can, they waste a lot of time wanting to know, oh doctor, hang on a moment, I have to know who shot this arrow. I have to know what sort of poison has been used in this arrow. I have to know which direction this arrow came from. It's really important for me to know all of these things. In fact, the most important thing for the man should be to survive this injury from the arrow, not to get answers to all these questions. And by the same token in Buddhism, because we are great pragmatists, that we always try to find solutions to the problems we find ourselves in now. Whether we have an intellectual explanation about many mysterious cosmological things doesn't make a difference to the effort we can make to practice to improve our lot in life. But saying that, in Buddhism we do find that there are references made to something of our ancient history as well. So what did he tell us? Actually, he didn't tell us about the beginning at all. But he told us about a long time ago in history, long before there were human beings in our world. So maybe you think, like, if you think the furthest back you possibly can in human history, maybe you think of dinosaurs or something like that. Maybe a little bit further than that, maybe you can think of trilobites swimming around in the sea or something like that. That's about as far as you can think back according to scientific prehistory. But what the Buddha was talking about was something even earlier than that. And it turns out that if we are to take dinosaurs seriously, then that is very recent history for our Earth. It's a sort of history which leaves behind a fossil record, but deep below that fossil record is even the aeons and aeons of history which went before. And the picture which we get from the scriptures in Buddhism is that in fact there may not have been a beginning at all. But there is a sort of cycle which goes on with our world, whereby the earth comes into being, goes through a period of prosperity, and then it breaks down again, and all life comes to an end on the earth, and then the cycle starts all over again. You may think that this sounds illogical, but if any of you have been reading up on cosmology recently, that means if you have read up on more recent theories than the theory of Big Bang, then you will know that cosmologists such as Stephen Hawking actually have proposed a lot of mathematical theories which actually are compatible with the Buddhist explanation of how things began. If we're talking about the time and the way things are arranged, then it goes something like this. Talking about cycles through which the world evolves, goes through a period of prosperity, golden age, then will decline, deteriorate, and there'll be a time when there's no life on earth at all. Then he talked about the sort of nature of beings or life on earth during each of these periods. During the times of prosperity, they'll be characterized by beings of a very high and subtle state of mind, who would have a long life, who would have a standard of living, and who would have an environment which was almost perfect. And they would have a high level of morality as well. As for the lower end of the spectrum, the times or the periods when life was very tough, the sort of beings alive at that time would have a very short lifespan, they would have a very low quality of mind, a low level of morality, the environment would be of a poor quality. When the Buddha actually started to describe about what happened during this cycle, he told a story about what happened during this part of the slope here. And apparently at that time, the universe had been in darkness for a long time. There weren't any forms of life in the universe to speak of, apart from certain beings with a very high quality of mind, known as apasara, or self-illuminated, you would say, gods. So not a creator god, but a whole lot of gods. And the reason that they had become gods in the first place was because during the time they had been human beings, they had managed to attain a high level of meditation. So when they passed away, that high state of meditation led them to a high state of mind and a high state of being. Their appearance would be something rather like this one here. Normally such beings don't have any sexual desires because they have transcended even what is known as male or female. And when these beings saw the earth, which had been on fire for many years after its previous cycle of destruction, so once it had been destroyed and had once again habitable. If you can imagine Earth which has been on fire for many years, maybe rather like volcanic rock or whatever, then it had quite a fragrance to it. Sometimes described as a fragrance similar to newly baked bread. And this aroma attracted these brightly self-illuminated beings, who out of curiosity came down and actually tasted some of what is known as curds of earth. Floating or food started to change some of them physically. The ones which ate more of the earth, who succumbed to their desire or curiosity for this physical food, found their complexion becoming darkened. Not only that, because they are eating physical food, they are actually weighed down by it. So they weren't able to just float around in the universe according to their whims anymore. The first thing that happened was that the ones which still had a brighter complexion discriminated against those which had the darker complexion. So this sort of discrimination, so from the mental impurity of curiosity or greed just now, we see that emerging to the mental impurity of discrimination now. And once they found themselves weighed down and unable to float around anymore, then they became earthbound. So according to this account, the first beings on earth were sort of stranded godlike beings, which became human because of their curiosity. So if you asked who created man, well, greed created man. It didn't need some sort of benevolent creator figure in the background saying, oh, now we're going to have a few people. But in fact, from the godlike beings, they became men just as if they were fallen angels. And the major factor is the greed in their own minds. This is the thing which has the power to create. As their state of mind became less subtle than before, then in fact the universe itself started to change in keeping with the lower state of mind of the beings inhabiting it. From a time where there was no sun or stars or moon, the sun, stars, moon started to appear in the universe. There started to be day and night. So instead of the only light in the universe coming from these beings themselves, it started to come from the various stars and planets. As these beings started to live on the earth for longer, then instead of being able to survive on these curds of earth, which you could say was a very nutritious and tasty supply of food, that became exhausted, and the nature of the environment started to change, so that instead of having these curds of earth to survive upon, the next sort of staple food which was available to them was that of a sort of mushroom-like plant. And as they ate more of these rougher sorts of diet, then this started to lead them to have some sort of digestive system inside them to handle and digest the food, because they were no longer living on subtle food anymore. Once a person has digestive organs, then something else which comes together with digestive organs is reproductive organs. And when that happened, it turned out that those beings who had in their past less tendency to be unfaithful to their spouse developed male reproductive organs, whereas those who had more tendency to be unfaithful to their spouse developed female reproductive organs. In the olden days, there was no reproduction, and there was a transcending of gender attributes. But from this time in the human history onwards, once their state of mind had decreased to a certain level, there started to be a distinction between male gender and female gender. Most of these very high-minded beings were horrified by the differences between the genders. But some weren't. Some actually became quite obsessed with the gender features which were not the same as their own. And some of them even started to pair off. And those beings that were pairing off started to build themselves houses to live in, not because it rained too much, but because they needed somewhere to conceal themselves once they engaged in this shameful act of reproduction, which they didn't want to do in front of their fellow beings. So they started to be settling down. Once beings settled down and became involved with a family way of life, then their state of mind became somewhat less subtle than before. And with that, the staple food in their environment started to change to be not just creepers anymore, but a sort of cereal or rice. But it was a cereal or rice much bigger than the rice grains which we have in the present day, where if you broke off a grain of rice from the plant, the very next day a new grain would have grown in its place without even a scar to indicate that the plant had been picked the day before. Those beings still had quite a long life compared to our own, but once they started to settle down, then the amount of food in the immediate area of their house started to become something more like their territory. And once people started to become possessive about the land on which they were living, and it was no longer just a free-for-all anymore, then again the quality of the staple food became less, so that it became like the rice in the present day. Now, if you broke off the grains of rice today, you might not be sure that next day it would have grown up again in its place. So there started to be a shortage of food. So people became quite territorial. Some were not only territorial, they became quite greedy as well. Greedy and lazy, so that instead of going out each day and picking enough rice to support themselves for that day, some picked a day's worth of rice and hoarded it in their house so that they could just lie around for longer at home and they didn't have to collect up this rice anymore. And when that happened, then the quality of life, the lifespan and so on, decreased further. And it became the case that a lot of people simply don't have any respect for one another anymore. A lot of people are very selfish, violent, and there seems to be a breakdown in order in a lot of societies. So there are many symptoms of this sort of thing happening. But I think, not to scare you too much, okay, the thought which I'd like to leave you with is that if you see this sort of thing happening in society, the only hope to slow things down or even to improve things in society is to start to encourage people to have more interest in a higher state of mind by practicing for yourself and by encouraging other people to practice as well.